Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. The topic for today's webinar is Tribal State Collaboration on Sustainability and Solar Development, a case study of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and we have members of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe with us today who will be talking about their work. Very excited to hear from them. Before I pass it over to our excellent speakers, I'd like to go over a few very quick webinar logistics. First of all, I wanted to ask for everyone's patience as we are getting used to this new version of GoToWebinar. We just upgraded to the new end of the platform. Please let us know if you're experiencing technical difficulties. Any feedback you have, we'd be interested. And sorry if we mess anything up on the technical end. Still getting used to it. We also want to tell you that you're in listen-only mode as attendees, but we do want to hear from you. We encourage you to submit your questions and your comments. We're going to be saving plenty of time for a Q&A following our presentations. It's one of the most valuable parts of our webinar to get to answer your questions, have that discussion. So please type your questions in as you think of them. On this newly updated iteration of GoToWebinar, you can turn on automated captions if that's helpful for you. They're automated, generally okay, not perfect, but that tool is available to you. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send you a copy of the webinar recording and the webinar slides. Send that out via email today or tomorrow. We'll also post those webinar materials on CESA's website, cesa.org/webinars. So with that out of the way, I'm very pleased to pass it over to my colleague, Matt Olaf. Matt is project manager here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will be moderating today's webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam, and thanks for everybody joining the webinar today. So CESA is a national nonprofit made up of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. Next slide, please. CESA works with state leaders, federal agencies, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to develop clean energy programs and inclusive renewable energy markets. CESA members, mostly state agencies, include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives in the country. And you can see our members' logos on your screen now. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is a product of CESA's Solar with Justice project. This project is looking into how states and community-based organizations can collaborate more effectively to advance solar in low-income and disadvantaged communities. The Solar with Justice project is primarily funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office, as well as additional funding from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Next slide, please. So the webinar today is the sixth and final case study that has been produced as part of the Solar with Justice project. You can find the previous 5 case studies and additional resources that have been produced as part of this project on CESA's website. And while the Solar with Justice project is primarily focused on collaboration between states and community-based organizations, this webinar and case study we are highlighting today focuses on state and tribal nation collaboration. So this case study released last week titled Tribal State Collaboration on Sustainability and Solar Development, a case study of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, explores the tribal-state relationship through the experience of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, which shares geography with the state of Minnesota. Over the past decade, the band has built relationships with state agencies, including the Minnesota Department of Commerce, in support of renewable energy and sustainability programs. The case study describes the band's work and successes, and it makes recommendations for how other tribes and states can work together collaboratively and effectively. Next slide, please. So we're joined today by Eugene Strowbridge and their colleague Brandy Toft. Brandy Toft is the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe's environmental director. Eugene is a social ecologist and the sustainability coordinator for the band. They are a Minnesota Green Corps alumnus and served with the band from 2019 to 2020 after graduating from the University of Washington, Seattle's Integrated Social Science program. They write both professionally and creatively about the intersections between human society and natural systems, climate change adaptation, and sustainability policy. Eugene is the author of this case study, and his presentation today will be providing an overview of that case study. Before I hand it over to Eugene, I'd like to mention that there will be time for Q&A after their presentations. If anyone has any questions while Eugene is speaking, please put them in the questions box, and we'll field those questions after the presentation. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Eugene.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Matt, very much for the introduction. I'm Eugene Strowbridge, the Sustainability Coordinator for the Leech Lake Band, and I wanted to just kind of start off by covering kind of the why of this case study and some quotes that I found that I included in the case study that were really helpful to me. There was a report entitled Government to Government Models of Cooperation Between States and Tribes that was released in 2009. And it said that public education does not teach that tribes are governments, and many adults, including state legislators, perceive tribes and tribal members as minorities or special interest groups. And that can really affect the way that those two entities coordinate, and it gets in the way a lot of the time. The Biden administration also released an executive order in 2023, and part of the text of that is that tribal self-determination is too often administered in ways that leave tribal nations unduly burdened and frustrated with the bureaucratic processes that they have to go through when dealing with federal funders and federal agencies. This is something that applies to states as well. And finally, I just wanted to include this quote by W. Ron Allen. He's the chairman of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe in Washington State. And the way that he put it was, it's very difficult to accomplish anything with the state if every time you meet someone you have to justify who you are, why you have a right to be involved. Tribes have treaties with the federal governments, and we are recognized in the U.S. Constitution, but that's something we often have to teach to every state official we meet. How are we supposed to get into the details of an issue on fisheries or taxes if we can't get past the ABCs? And I think that's a frustration and a story that many tribal nations across the country would identify with. And so I just wanted to provide that context of kind of where I'm coming from and the problems that the band sees with kind of interfacing with state and federal partners. Next slide, please. So that's the title of the case study and a beautiful picture of where Leech Lake is located. We're located in north central Minnesota. It is quite gorgeous, and I encourage you to come visit if you have the time. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a timeline of the development of the sustainability program and sustainability projects on the reservation. As you can see, it starts out quite small with the wind feasibility study way back in 2003, but it built on itself quite quickly, and we're definitely showing more progress now that the ball is rolling. So I thought the best way to frame this case study might be to kind of show Leech Lake's journey in our sustainability program and show how that progress kind of built over time. Next slide, please. So the wind feasibility study was a 5-year study, and it was just looking at suitability of wind power on the reservation. And it found that there are far too many trees for it to be much viable. However, we did identify one spot at the Buganagashig Tribal School that it might be feasible. And this was just kind of one of the first projects dipping the toes in the water and moving towards renewable energy and sustainable development on the reservation. Next slide, please. So moving off of that, we have the green team. And this was kind of the catalyst for much of the work that followed. For a long time, people working on sustainability related things on the reservation were doing so kind of in their own silos, and they were doing it in addition to their other job duties because they were passionate about it. Eventually, that led to the formation of an interdisciplinary team where we got people from many different departments across the tribal government to all kind of get together and discuss what they're doing to further sustainability in their own programs and in their own departments, and then to kind of start coordinating and see how to build a little more capacity. And that was really the thing that formed the impetus for the sustainability program and for everything that it really became. Next slide, please. So around the time the wind feasibility study was wrapping up, the band installed its first solar furnaces on tribal homes in the Prescott community. And that really marks the first introduction of renewable energy onto the reservation. And we partnered with the Leech Lake Tribal College and Honor the Earth to also educate and train local women for careers in solar, including the installation of solar furnaces. And today we have 23 of those on the reservation, mostly on residential homes. Next slide, please. So in 2014, the band became the first tribal nation to join the Green Step Cities program, which is now called the Green Step Cities and Tribal Nations program. That was interesting because at the time there were no tribal nations participating. And so Brandy talked and the Green team reached out to the MPCA and, kind of asked, is there a way that tribes can get involved in this program? And they were willing to work with us. And so we kind of made some tweaks there so that it was appropriate for tribal nations. And today we are at step 5, which is the highest recognition available to the program. And we are still working with the MPCA to try to figure out how to adapt this model and some more of their recognition programs to be more inclusive of tribal nations. Next slide, please. So next, in 2017, the band secured funding for a community solar garden, and it's the first of its kind in the nation. The power generated is sold to the grid, and then the money is used to subsidize the heating bills of low-income families in the winter. Much like the solar furnace project, it also included a workforce development component that brought in Leech Lake Tribal College students for on-the-job training in solar installation. I think this project is a really good one to kind of illustrate some of the friction points and workarounds that come with coordinating between a tribal nation and state partners. Because of net metering laws in Minnesota, if a solar array has a capacity of 40 kilowatts or less, the utility must pay for power generated at the average retail rate. But for over 40 kilowatt arrays, that is not the case. So we had to kind of be creative to make this economically feasible. Another thing that kind of complicates this is that the Leech Lake Reservation is quite large. It's about the size of Rhode Island, and there are actually 5 different utilities on the reservation that the band has to negotiate with when they're developing any kind of solar asset. So some of those utilities are co-ops, and they are not governed by the Public Utilities Commission. And because of that, they don't fall under the rule of having to pay market rate for solar arrays that have a capacity of less than 40 kilowatts. So this kind of brought the project to a halt as we tried to figure out, we wanted a 200 kilowatt array, but it was a question of whose service territory is it going in? How do we make this work with utilities who aren't willing or obligated to pay market rate for the electricity? And what the band had to do was to split the 200 kilowatt arrays into 5 separate 40 kilowatt arrays, and they're kind of scattered across the reservation. This was a solution that made the project more financially viable, but it kind of introduced its own set of problems. Like I said, the reservation's very large, and because of the challenging geography with the large lakes and national forests in the middle of it, it can take quite a long time to travel from one end to the other. So getting to these 5 different sites for maintenance and doing tours even to the community, it's much more unwieldy than the band did if it had gone through in its original form as a 200 kilowatt array. Next slide, please. So those are the locations of the first solar arrays, and as you can see, it is separated by quite some distance. Despite that, it is a great project, and we're very thankful that our partners were able to work with us on that and kind of figure out how to make that feasible. Next slide, please. So the Guaranteed Energy Savings Plan is one of the next big undertakings that the band took on with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and it was to install new energy control measures on 22 of the tribally owned buildings across the reservation. It was a very big project. It was $4.2 million, and the Minnesota Department of Commerce was able to provide a bunch of support with that, including financial assistance, technical, contractual, and they really were the drivers behind that program. However, in the final report, it was noted that reviewing and processing the reams of paperwork associated with accessing that help from the Minnesota Department of Commerce was one of the largest barriers to the program happening in itself. And I think that's one good example of how oftentimes states can come to the table with an idea of how they can help and what is helpful, and that doesn't always necessarily survive the reality, and sometimes the state's processes end up getting more in the way of tribal projects than they are helpful, and vice versa, just because we're dealing with two government entities that oftentimes have very different processes. It can be a point of friction when they come together to work on things if either side does not understand or respect the processes of the other. It can lead to delays and, bureaucratic processes that really weigh things down. Next slide, please. So these are some of the buildings that were retrofitted through the GES program, and despite the bureaucratic hurdles, we got through those, and it has been a very successful project, and it's saving us around $200,000 a year in energy payments, and they're actually working better than expected, so we're very happy about that. Next slide, please. These are some of the impacts of the GES program. As you can see, it was pretty substantial, and actually, even though electricity rates increased by 4.8% over the project period, we still managed to decrease our costs by almost 7%. Next slide, please. So in 2018, the band partnered with Pale Blue Dot and CERTS, which is a kind of a large partnership that includes members of the Minnesota Department of Commerce, nonprofits, universities, and CERTS was able to give us some funding to develop a solar master plan. And with that, we were able to look at all of the different tribally owned facilities on the reservation, assess them for solar suitability, and that really laid the groundwork for our solar planning into the future, because anytime we have the opportunity to develop more solar, we now have this thick guidebook that details all of our buildings and, what's the best place to deploy these arrays, whether economically or, the best site for getting the most energy. We also developed a population vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation framework, and that was spurred on by the MPCA, and we also partnered with Pale Blue Dot on that. So through partnership with the state on these projects, we were able to really lay this solid planning groundwork for what was to come next. Next slide, please. Also in 2018, the band installed its first EV chargers at Cedar Lakes, Northern Lights, and White Oak casinos. 5 of the chargers are level 2 chargers and are free of cost to band members. Next slide, please. In 2021, CERTS once again came to the table to help us out with some policy guidance documents. We were able to develop an Approaching Net Zero Energy Building Guide, Solar Ready Guide, and Electric Vehicle Guide for the reservation. Next slide, please. In 2022, the band hired a sustainability coordinator to work on its green initiatives full-time, and that's me. It's probably my favorite part of our journey, but I digress. Next slide, please. Right, so this brings us to a little more current projects on the reservation. We're beginning our second phase of solar PV deployment on the reservation. We got federal funding for that, and we're adding 534 kilowatts of capacity in 10 separate arrays, 9 of which are roof mounted and 1 of which is ground mounted in an apple grove. And although this is primarily done with federal funding, would like to note that because of our engagement with the MPCA and CERTs early on in our journey, developing the Solar Ready Guide and the Solar Master Plan, that's really the only reason that the band was able to capture this large pot of federal funding, is that we had partners who were willing to work with us early on and do all of the due diligence, the feasibility studies, and make it so that we really had a firm foundation planning-wise. Next slide, please. We're also beginning our phase 2 EV charger deployment. It's going to put 14 level 2 chargers and 2 level 3 chargers across the reservation. And this one is quite important because as the state is building out its own EV deployment plan, they are mostly favoring major highway corridors, which makes sense. However, it's not the most useful for people living on the reservation because we have a lot of scattered and isolated communities that live off of that highway corridor. So we were kind of asking ourselves, how do we serve those people and make sure that they're not being left behind? The EV charger isn't going to do as much good if you have to travel quite a way to that major highway corridor and just kind of go outside of your community to do your charging. And the same grant through the Department of Commerce that is allowing us to fund some of these tribal chargers is also allowing us to test 2 plug-in hybrid EVs for our fleet management. And we're hosting 2 EV ride and drive events to spur interest on the reservation. So this was another opportunity that we had to coordinate with the Department of Commerce and our state partners and think about how the band could deploy some programs that would complement the state's emphasis on the major highway corridors. And they kind of helped us think about, what are we going to use this extra money for? How do we spur interest in EVs on the reservation in a way that, the state maybe wasn't thinking about? How do we work with our state partners to kind of put it in their heads what more rural entities are thinking about and our concerns? Next slide, please. So as a continuation of the population vulnerability assessment, which kind of makes predictions about climate impacts and, answers the question, who are the most vulnerable groups on the reservation and what are our concerns moving forward? We developed a climate change adaptation plan. And this was also with the assistance of the Department of Commerce. And it was an interesting project in that partnering with Commerce allowed us to develop it, but early on in the project, it was decided that we would kind of go based on what the state had. They had a template that applied for, cities and municipalities, but not necessarily tribal nations. And we decided we were going to adapt that, and after a long time kind of beating our head against the wall about it, we realized that there wasn't an appropriate way necessarily to adapt a template for cities or other municipalities to a tribal nation because there's too much of a cultural disconnect around the way that the environment and sustainability are seen. We were kind of worried about that because we were running up against the wire for a funding period with the Department of Commerce. But because of the relationships that we had nurtured with them throughout the years, we were able to approach them and kind of explain what was going on and explain that we could push this out as is. It wouldn't be very useful, however, and the community was having a hard time connecting with it because it wasn't true to their experiences or their feelings or thoughts about the environment and the framing. And Luckily, the Department of Commerce was very accommodating, and they said, we can stretch this out as long as you need us to. We need to make sure that you guys have a plan that makes sense for you. And so they were very accommodating on that, and we are very thankful. Next slide, please. We're also developing an inventory of emissions produced by government functions. That's going to give us a better picture of the impact we're having, as well as providing recommendations for reducing that impact. And that is kind of happening at multiple levels with multiple different partners. We're working with the state on kind of the statewide greenhouse gas emissions. We're working with some local partners. We kind of had several different scales of emissions inventory going on. And when all of them are done, they're all going to be included in the climate change adaptation plan. Next slide, please. So finally, looking ahead, what the band is wanting to do with sustainability moving forward is to tackle food waste. We have 3 different casinos on the reservation, and so that's an area that we've been looking at a lot, is eliminating waste. We also recently purchased the grocery store in Cass Lake. So there's a lot of avenues for us to reduce waste and make sure that that food is getting to people on the reservation, much of which is a food desert. So we need to figure out, how can we stop throwing this stuff away and get it to the people who need it. We also need to develop clean public transportation options. As I mentioned earlier, the reservation is about the size of Rhode Island, and it's peppered with large lakes, national forests. It's quite difficult to get around, especially if you don't have your own vehicle. So we're looking at ways to tackle that. Next slide, please. So finally, we come to some best practices we've kind of developed through our experiences working with the state. And the first is that parties on both sides of this relationship should do what they can to empower advocates. The initial impetus for all of our sustainability work was really a handful of individuals working at the tribe who wanted to forward sustainability as best they could on top of their regular job duties. And for a while, it was just them working their own, kind of isolated, not talking to each other. But it's really important when you're at that stage to empower those advocates as much as you can to keep pushing and to keep doing that work and forming those relationships. Next, we found it very helpful to create an inter-organizational team. After it was just a handful of individuals working on it, they came together and formed the Green Team, which was the push behind a lot of our early sustainability projects. It allowed these individuals who were working in silos to get together and coordinate, kind of create a brain trust and see how they could share resources to do even more. Next, it's really important that you look for recurring opportunities for collaboration. For us, that was the Green Step Cities program and the Minnesota Green Corps program. And to a little bit of a lesser extent, the CERT seed grant. That allowed us to come to the table with our state partners, periodically, once a year when these new programs kicked off. And we found that every year, the more we communicated with our state partners, the more these programs kind of changed and grew to accommodate tribal participants. So it's really building this long-standing, constantly evolving partnership that's it's really had a lot of progress in our journey. So next, it's very important to assert and respect sovereignty. Tribal nations have to insist on being met where they are and in an appropriate way, because a lot of the time when state partners come to the table, it's without the knowledge of tribes being sovereign nations and what that means, what a government-to-government relationship means. And oftentimes they can kind of overstep. It's important for tribal employees to be able to assert that sovereignty and to say, there's an appropriate way for this relationship to work. and it's a government-to-government relationship that needs to be founded on mutual respect for differences and for the different bureaucratic processes. Like I mentioned, occasionally, the state will get frustrated with tribal partners because they think something's taking too long or some element of the process isn't working the way that it would work on the state side. And similarly, that goes both ways. And sometimes tribal people and professionals can get frustrated with the state because, it's two different governments, two different sets of policies and practices. And I think it's important for partners on both sides of that relationship to kind of be open about that. We have our own processes, and if you want to partner with us, we have to respect those and to find a way to make both of them work together. Next, it's very important to honor connections between people and the land. State employees and others that are often more familiar with Western knowledge systems have this tendency to emphasize data in these projects and hard numbers. And if they're giving out funding for a project, they want to know what are the metrics here. But oftentimes that's not the way that projects are approached from a tribal perspective. And it's much more place-based and much more emphasis on relationships. And one way that we've found to kind of break down that wall between state and tribal agencies is just to invite our partners to the reservation and to kind of, learn about the land in a way that is more than just numbers on a page, because that can often cause quite a disconnect when there's distant state agencies that are looking at your area and looking at what you have going on, and it just becomes kind of a spreadsheet, right? And that makes it difficult to work with tribal partners because these are people living on this land that have been living on this land. They have an ongoing, very intimate relationship with the land, and they view it as something much more than just numbers on a page. So one of the most powerful things that we found to break through that is to invite our partners here and kind of give them a tour and show them, this is the land, this is how we live, these are our values. And they often come away with a much more appropriate and much more accurate view of the way that people view their relationship with the land. I did want to include here a quote from a paper that I found that said, this relatively narrow set of place meaning serves to legitimize the existing power of dominant groups, benefiting both organized environmental groups and commodity industries, as well as scientific experts and resource specialists. Missing are the rich layered place meanings that are expressed and valued by people not strongly affiliated with organized interest groups or industries, or trained in a natural science discipline or resource management. So that kind of speaks to the way in which the state and Western sciences emphasis on numbers and metrics is often missing that vital layer of cultural and personal relation to the land. Finally, the last best practice we have is to be persistent. Change is often slow, especially with relationships, and especially with governance and policy work. Tribal nations and states are not going to develop equitable and well-functioning working relationships overnight, especially when there is that lack of knowledge when you're first starting out. So it's really something that you have to fall back on the other best practice I mentioned, looking for recurring opportunities for collaboration. You have to make sure that you're coming to the table, both sides of the relationship, frequently to discuss how things are going, to discuss how you might better work together. And that's something you really have to do over long periods of time. The relationship that the band has now with our state partners, including the Department of Commerce, the NPCA, CERTS, and many others, it's better now than when we started, but it has often been slow, and it's important to not get bogged down and frustrated, and to know that relationships will change slowly over time, and you just have to keep coming back to the table, keep representing your viewpoint, keep empowering your advocates, insisting on sovereignty, and looking for ways that both can coordinate and respect the differences and processes of the other. Next slide, please. So that was the bulk of my presentation. There is my contact information should you like to get a hold of me afterwards. And I believe I will hand it off to Matt and we can go to questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Eugene, for the excellent presentation covering just some of the great work that you and the band have done. So yeah, we'll go ahead and transition to the Q&A portion. We've gotten a few questions already, but please, attendees, feel free to submit any questions you may have. Some of these questions are addressing some of the things you touched on towards the end, best practices, so some higher level questions. But to start it off, I'll ask this one. Have you seen changes or improvements in how state agencies are consulting with the band? If so, what are those changes or improvements?
We have, yeah. One thing that's always tricky about consultation is that if you don't sit down and have an honest conversation between tribal and state partners about what that consultation means, things get missed. When we started working with our state partners, oftentimes we would receive some new information that we didn't know about and we should have known about ahead of time, and we would reach out to them and their response would be, we did offer the tribal consultation, we emailed the tribal chairman, and we did not receive a response. Something that state agencies don't really understand about that is that reaching out to the highest ranking official to discuss something or to notify something through email is not really appropriate. It would kind of be the same as me shooting an email to the governor or the president and expecting him to read it or to respond. It doesn't really make sense. And that's something that we've worked with our partners on, and now we have kind of a contact list going with many of our partners we work with often. So they know, it's not just to send a letter out to the chairman or to a high-ranking official. They actually have contacts within our different divisions and departments. So depending upon what the issue is, they now have a more appropriate way of contacting the right person.
Great, thanks. And then the next two questions are somewhat related. How should state agencies think about tribal sovereignty, and what further improvements can state agencies make to honor tribal sovereignty?
I think maybe the best way for states to think about tribal sovereignty is that you're not working with an interest group or an organization or a municipality. You're working with an organization that is on par with the federal government. So when you're working with them, you need to respect their processes and respect the way they do things to the same extent you would if you were dealing with another state or dealing with the federal government. Oftentimes that means listening to the tribe about what their processes are and not simply wading into the partnership and imposing, state policies and procedures onto things. Oftentimes that can mean being more flexible. Sometimes tribal processes take longer than the state would like. Sometimes the state decides to draw a hard deadline and say, we need it by this time. And tribal representatives will say, well, we can't do that. That's not how our process works. And I think the state's role in that situation is to hear that and to adapt their processes to kind of accommodate for the fact that they're working with a tribe.
Great, thank you. And somewhat related, what are the most respectful ways to initiate first contact with local reservations from the state/state agency perspective?
I think the best way to do that might be to try to figure out who your counterpoint is as far as a tribal representative and just start a dialogue. Just reach out say that you would like to coordinate more and you would like to learn more about how you can best coordinate with them. Like I mentioned in the presentation too, site visits, that goes a long way towards building that relationship. Shooting an email to somebody who lives in a rural community many hours away and asking them to describe where they're coming from is one thing. It's an entirely other thing to, leave your office, go to where the tribe is, meet them where they're at, and kind of, immerse yourself. It definitely helps the relationship because from the tribe's perspective, then it's not some anonymous state bureaucrat in an office somewhere often hours away. It puts a face to the name and it really goes a long way towards building an actual relationship.
Great. A question about one of the programs. Can you speak more about your green team? Are there terms or just based on interest of team members?
Yeah, I can do that. There's not terms. It remains a completely kind of ad hoc group. We do try to have a nice kind of sampling of representatives from the various tribal programs and divisions that most work in sustainability, but anyone is free to join, and that is kind of just our forum for making sure that all of these different departments and divisions that touch on different things, whether it's energy efficiency, clean transportation, we need to make sure these people are talking to each other regularly, right? Because you get more done that way.
Great. So thinking of states like Minnesota that have multiple tribal nations within their geography, um, how could a state think about effectively consulting with all of the tribal nations, on a particular program?
That can be tricky, definitely. I think that one of the best ways to do it is to, once you have contacts within the various tribal governments, I would, reach out to them all at the same time. And as opposed to having them come to you, I would say that you should go to them. Maybe find a tribe that is willing to host the event, and then send representatives from the state to meet with tribal representatives on tribal land. Not only does that, like I said, build a foundation for that relationship, it also shows the tribes that you're serious. Because once again, it's easy to shoot an email, but it's a little harder to drive 4.5 hours to a place you're unfamiliar with and sit down and meet with people and ask them, where they're coming from. That shows more dedication to the relationship, and it shows the tribes that you're serious about it.
Great, thanks. And then kind of on the flip side, when there, and you mentioned this in the case study and in your presentation, but if you could elaborate, if there are multiple agencies, state agencies that are engaging with tribes, how should these state agencies think about maybe trying to communicate better amongst each other to more effectively consult with individual tribal nations?
I think the best way to do that might be to create an inter-organizational team, much like the band's Green Team. Many state departments have tribal liaisons, but often they only work with a certain subset of tribes or within a narrowly defined area. If you could create an inter-organizational team made up of those tribal liaisons and of the people who most frequently deal with tribes, and get those people to meet regularly and to kind of share information and build relationships collectively, I think that would go a long way towards making that more workable. Because that is a huge problem that we had before the Green Team, was that we had all of these individual actors trying to interface with state agencies, and it's tough to do on your own, And it's much easier to do when you can all kind of share contacts and best practices, and that really kind of lets the relationship snowball so that you know, it's kind of on multiple levels and it rests with multiple people. The other thing about that is that then, if one person were to leave to take a new job, retire, all of those relationships and that relationship building doesn't just go away with them because it's resting with this larger group of people.
Great, thanks. And I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but um, and I don't know if the band is a federally recognized tribe. I would assume it is, but how should states engage with tribal nations that are not federally recognized? In the similar way, or are there unique challenges?
I think there are definitely unique challenges there, but I would suggest that any tribal nation that you're interfacing with be given the same respect for their sovereignty and for their processes. Um, it's not really something that I have dealt with before, but that would be my general feeling is to treat them like you would any other tribal nation. Because that relationship, as far as like being federally recognized, that's something I would encourage state agencies to kind of stay out of. And any tribal nation that you're cooperating with, just give them the same respect for their sovereignty and difference that you would any other tribe.
Great. All right, we're running into the end of our submitted questions. Again, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to submit them. Another question that you have touched on, but again, if you could elaborate on this, the distinction between treating tribal nations like a constituency or an interest group versus a sovereign nation. And again, some of this might be redundant to what we've already covered.
Yeah. So when the state is approaching like an interest group, I think there's a sense in which the state thinks that it has the right to dictate how things are going to go. They're often the authority or the regulator in these relationships. So I think they're used to entering into conversations with groups and saying, this is how this is the state process, and this is the process we need to follow in order to, you know, do whatever it is the relationship and the partnership is focusing on. And oftentimes, state agencies will come to tribes with the same attitude, but that's really not appropriate because it's a government to government relationship. The state needs to recognize that the tribe has its own policies and procedures. And so coming to the table and saying, this is how it works, this is how it's going to go, is not the right attitude. And it is very off putting for tribal professionals.
Great, thank you. Next question. Are there other resources you would recommend for learning more about this topic of working with tribes as a state agency?
I do have some bibliography of the case study. I would really recommend looking at some of the recent MOUs between tribes and states as far as like land management goes. Another great model is there are more co-management agreements being signed between like national forests and tribes as far as co-managing their resources. That is a really good place to kind of look for best practices. It's still kind of a new thing, but it's rapidly gaining steam, and a lot of these groups that are kind of sharing management over these resources are kind of having to develop these models as they go along. And so that's a great place to look. Look at the national forests collaborating with tribes around forest resources. And I think that's all I have to offer without looking at my bibliography I made.
Sounds great. Well, I think that concludes our Q&A portion. Thanks everybody for attending, and obviously thanks Eugene for all your time and expertise, answering questions and presenting your information. Everybody who is attending and registered for the webinar, as Sam mentioned at the beginning of this, will receive an email with the recording of the webinar. And again, this case study is on the CESA website, so you can refer to these resources at the end of the case study that Eugene just mentioned. But yeah, thanks again, and I will pass it over to my colleague Sam to close us out.
Hey, thank you very much, Matt, and Eugene, thank you so much. That was really fantastic. Before everyone leaves, I want to let you know we do have a lot of upcoming webinars. We have more, in fact, than I could fit on the little area of my slide here. A lot of really interesting stuff coming up, including a webinar tomorrow on Massachusetts electric school bus program. So we hope you'll join us. You can read more about these and other upcoming webinars on cesa.org/webinars. Thanks again, everybody. See you at the next one.